Hey folks, it's Gary. I'm back again. I was going to give you all a day off, but maybe tomorrow. Who knows? Decided today to do a wow, Mayor's messy. Decided to do today one of my favorite composers, my top four, Eberhard Weber. I knew I was always going to do this. I just had to pull the vinyl. He's interesting, an ECM artist. Just about one of the only ECM artists I got into, not as a result of hearing him on somebody else's albums. If you go back to my video where I talked about how I got into the ECM artists in particular, I started with Bar Phillips, and then from hearing guitarist Terji Ripdol play on a Bar Phillips album, I bought one of Terji's albums. That album had Jack DeJohnette on it and Miroslav Vidis, both of whom were recorded as leaders for ECM. So I ended up buying Miroslav Vidis albums. I ended up buying Jack DeJohnette albums. From Jack DeJohnette's albums, I heard, well, actually, both from Jack DeJohnette's Pictures album and from another Bar Phillips album, Mountainscapes, I also heard guitarist John Abercrombie, who recorded for ECM. And I started buying Abercrombie's discs. From Abercrombie's discs, I heard Dave Holland, the bassist, and it just went on and on and on. So most of the artists I got into as a result of hearing them play on other people's albums on the ECM label. And I had shown and mentioned how ECM used to always include a catalog in almost every single one of their vinyl releases. Well, oddly enough, even though Eberhard Weber played on other people's albums, I actually first heard of him from these ECM catalogs that they included very, very smartly with just nearly almost all of their vinyl releases. And the good things that I mentioned with this catalog is it's not just here's a picture of the album and it's so-and-so's album. They always gave a breakdown, which you can't quite read here, but they always gave a breakdown of exactly who played on the albums and what the instrumentation was. So if you wanted a solo album by a guy that plays just acoustic guitars, you could find it. If you wanted a solo album by a guy that plays electric keyboards and guitars and all that, you could figure out what album that was from here. You wanted to hear a guitar, bass, drums trio. You wanted to hear a piano trio, piano solo, whatever. This was a smart move because looking through these, I was already maybe, I don't know, a year and a half into ECM at this point, and I got to the point where I was, looking, after you're done looking at the album cover while you're sitting there listening to the music, daydreaming, looking at the sky or your ceiling or whatever, start thumbing through this thing and think, oh, that looks like a cool album. And it got to the point when all I was buying was ECM albums. And that's how I actually first came across the Eberhard Weber thing. Like I said, he had played as a sideman in people's groups. But oddly enough, the first place I heard him was just, I decided to take the plunge because there wasn't anything on ECM I bought that I didn't like. There was a lot of variation there, some pretty out there stuff. So I took the plunge, and the only reason I probably bought this one, well, Little Movements. This is his third and last album he made with a quartet that he called Colors, and it had my favorite saxophone player of all time, which was my introduction to him, Charlie Mariano, who plays not only saxophones but flutes, usually like wood flutes and things like that. Very exotic, tons of style, tons of experimentation for an older guy that came, from the bebop generation. Charlie, all the way until the end, he never stopped experimenting. One of the first guys in his generation to really look into world music and play Indian reed instruments. He was all over the place stylistically. He even, dabbled a little bit in fusion, not so much the commercial side of it, but just rather from using electric keyboards and electric guitars in the context of his bands kind of thing. Played with the College of Percussion, various Indian musicians. Charlie Mariano was should have been an American icon that everybody should have known. It should have been reported when he died, which of course it wasn't. So this is the first album I bought. This was recorded in July of 1980 and probably released in late 80. And this is the first one. I bought this as a new release, so it was kind of easy to pick out. It was a new release. Turns out to be my favorite of the three, and no one else's favorite of the three albums that Colors recorded. Everybody says this is a lesser one, and I can't agree. It's my favorite one of the three. So the band had Eberhard Weber on bass, and he wrote most of the compositions. He wrote all of the compositions for the band. This album is an exception. There's one track written by the keyboard player of the group, Rainier Bruninghouse, which was my introduction to him. And it's the only Colors album that had a track by him, a track called Bally, which I love. It's a fantastic piece. And the only piece on the three Eberhard Weber Colors albums that was not written by Weber. And so Charlie Mariano, Rainier Bruninghouse, and on the last two albums by the group, John Marshall, drummer and percussion. John Marshall, this is my introduction to him. I only learned many, many, many years later. Everybody else knows John Marshall from, if they know him at all, from Soft Machine. He joined Soft Machine. He was maybe their, I think, third drummer in Soft Machine, but he joined them in the early 70s and was the only musician to stay from that point on with all of the various lineups of Soft Machine. They had no original members after a few years. They went through a ton of musicians, but John Marshall was always their drummer. Even after the band no longer was using the Soft Machine name, they used Soft Machine Legacy. He's still a drummer for Legacy. So that was my introduction to him. I love this album. This is an easy one to get into too. This isn't avant-garde stuff. It's a quartet, keyboards, bass, drums, and the saxophone and flutes are the lead voice. The keyboards there's acoustic piano and electronic keyboards, which this is a fantastic band to demonstrate the use of electric keyboards, and especially at this time, the late 70s, early 80s. A lot of those synthesizer sounds don't sound so good today when you listen to them. Ray Bruninghouse, very careful to use sounds that were very complementary, and they to me they sound fantastic today. They don't sound dated at all. I love this album. I still love this album to this day. It's still my favorite group project. Instead of jumping in and buying all the other two albums that were recorded earlier by the Colors group, I took a big jump, and I took a big jump because I guess I was kind of ready at this point after hearing Bar Phillips' Journal Violin 2, which introduced me to a whole new way of listening to music. I didn't have to have drums, I didn't have to have guitars anymore at that point to have something to relate to, because the Journal Violin 2 was just a vocalist singing wordless melodies for the most part, an upright bassist, and a saxophone player who played a little bit of background synthesizer. And so there were no instruments on there that I actually played, and yet I got into that album. So when I saw Fluid Russell, oh, by the way, Eberhard Weber's wife does all these covers, Maja Weber, and I love the covers. And sadly, she passed away a couple years ago. I only learned about it within the last year, probably not even a year ago, that she passed away. There's somewhere on the internet. There's an interview with Eberhard Weber, and he mentioned that his wife had passed away sometime after Eberhard Weber's stroke several years ago. And I don't know the details of it, and I was saddened to hear that because her images are absolutely iconic for this music. But the reason this is so different is, again, there's no real drummers on here. There's no real drums on here. There's actually no synthesizer keyboards either. What this is there's two vocalists, Bonnie Herman and Norma Winstone. This is the first time I ever heard Norma Winstone, and she was at the time recording in another band for ECM Records called Azimuth. And after hearing the vocals on this, which are just lovely wordless things, eventually I went and got into Azimuth's discography, which is substantial. Talk about atmospheric music, and I'll do a whole video on that. But that was my introduction to both Bonnie Herman, who I think there was a group called Singers Unlimited that she was in, and Norma Winstone, who has a solo career as well as being in Azimuth. And this is the first time I heard Gary Burton, the Vibes player. Gary Burton was already famous in America, American musician. In the late 60s, he had one of the first kind of jazz rock quartets when he brought guitar into his group, electric guitar, and yet I didn't hear from that era. This is where I first heard Gary Burton. Gary Burton is the sole harmonic instrument on here. He plays vibraphone and marimba, and this is all composed, written out stuff. There's a little room for solos in here. You also have Eberhard Weber on bass and Bill Frisell on guitar. This is the first place I heard Bill Frisell. I only learned years later that this was his first session, his first professional session, which is why I'd never heard of him. And I liked his playing is very sparse. I was wrong. The guitar is also a harmonic instrument, so I was wrong when I said that the vibraphone is the only harmonic instrument. I guess what I'm thinking of is when you listen to this, the guitar doesn't really play very many chords at all. It's mostly single lines that it plays. He gets a little bit of soloing space, but it's very sparse. It's not like the distorted, loud rock soloing. It fits music that doesn't have percussion in it. There's an occasional sound, very rarely in a couple up-tempo sections. It sounds like a bass drum. And there's something on here called a tarang that Eberhard Weber plays. And I don't know what a tarang is, but my guess is that it may be that bass drum sound that you hear for a couple moments. And Frisell also plays a balalaika, which is if I'm not mistaken, a Greek stringed instrument. He just strums it in one section of the music, and then the voices come in. This is a beautiful album. It's a little avant-garde at times. The first side of it, which is a 17.5-minute thing, is all beautiful. The second side has some more experimental stuff on there. I love it all, but if you were going to introduce it to somebody, you would stick with the first side, the first 17 minutes and a half, which is a thing called Quiet Departures, which this is one of those albums. I have listened to this so much over the years. First of all, I have 2 vinyl copies, and I have it on CD. This is one of those things that I've listened to so much that I wish I could erase part of my memory. I could sing at any given point in this record, I could sing you the next line that the bass player is going to play, what the vocalists are going to sing, what the guitarist is going to do, what the vibraphone or marimba is going to play. I just have listened to this thousands of times. And I wish I hadn't. There's very little left to discover, and yet I don't stay away from this one for long. I just can't. And the multiple images, all by his wife, Maja Weber, are just beautiful. As a matter of fact, as a result of this, I didn't know at the time that Bill Frisell hadn't recorded any other albums on his own or gigs, with other people. So I kept looking for his stuff and didn't find any. And eventually, in 82, I think it was, in August of 82, so this probably came out in 83, he did record his first solo album. He did other sessions between. He became the guitarist for Jan Garbrick's group eventually. But the reason I'm showing this is solely because, and I mentioned this before, Maja Weber once was asked by Bill Frisell to design the cover. So this was his first solo album. It was recorded for ECM. But I guess Bill had seen the artwork not only on Fluid Russell that he played on, but probably on the other Eberhard Weber albums as well, and was impressed enough with it to ask Maja Weber to design his cover when he did his first solo album. And that's really the reason I'm showing this, because a nice little dedication to her. And the fact that they don't reproduce this on the CD version of the album, I guess there's too many small pictures here. And they're beautiful. It's such a shame that there's not a way to reproduce this nowadays. It's a nice little testimony to the quality of Maja Weber's works, because oddly enough, she didn't do album covers for anybody else besides her husband and this one Bill Frisell album. So that's why I showed that. So after Fluid Russell, which is a fantastic album, I realized Eberhard Weber basically has 2 types of albums that he made at the time. And that is his group albums, where he would put together a small group and they would play not traditional jazz, but the music was set up in a traditional jazz sense, in that there would be a theme that each piece would have, and then the various soloists in the band would get a chance to solo, and then they would state the theme again and end the piece. Like traditional groups, jazz groups do. And then there was his composition albums, I noticed. Fluid Russell was a composition album. That was almost entirely written out with only little small sections for the various musicians to solo in, but it was very much a limited span of space. Oops, my TV just came on. There's a very much limited amount of space for the soloist. It was a very set length, whereas on the jazz albums, it was like the soloist would pretty much go as long as he wanted and kind of cue the band back in when it was time to go back to the theme when he felt like he had said his piece. But it was interesting because you know, when you would pick up a new Eberhard Weber album, you would look at the personnel involved and try to figure out, I wonder if this is a group jazz album or whether this is a composition album. Usually you can tell by looking at them. I'm not quite sure the orders I got these in next, but these are earlier albums, prior to Fluid Rustle and Little Movements. Fluid Rustle was 79, by the way. Little Movements was 80, and this is 77. So this is the second album by Eberhard Weber's Colors, another, you know, cover image by his wife. And this had the same exact lineup. This is a Colors album, Eberhard Weber's Colors album. Same exact lineup as Little Movements with John Marshall on drums. This is the first time he played with the group. Rainier Bruninghouse on keyboards, and Charlie Mariano on saxophones. This, a lot of people list as their favorite Colors albums of the three. It's really good. They're all really good. I just like Little Movements. What can I tell you? Fantastic cover image, again, by Majo Weber. And going back to the first Colors album, Yellow Fields. Another, there's a lot of glare there. It's a little tough to get rid of. Yellow Fields goes back to September 75. And again, this is the quartet with Charlie Mariano on sax, Eberhard Weber on bass, Rainier Bruninghouse on keyboards, and this time John Christensen was the original drummer of the band, and my favorite drummer of all time happens to play on this. Another good album. Oddly enough, Rainier Bruninghouse used to use a lot of acoustic piano and synthesizers. On this album, he uses a lot of electric piano, and I don't know if maybe there was an acoustic piano in the studio that they recorded in. It really does change the Colors atmosphere of the music. You know, that one slight change of acoustic and electric piano, it's a little different. It's a little different sounding. Some people I've seen also said that this is their favorite. It does have a piece called Touch, which is 4 minutes and 58 seconds, which is a great encapsulation of what this group can do if you want it in a little bite-sized chunk, because you can't take a 15-minute track or something. And Touch is a really beautiful track. I'd probably play that for a non-jazz fan or somebody that I just wanted to give them a taste of what the group sounded like. John Christensen, I don't know the situation that he left the band, but I do know that he played with Keith Jarrett at the time. He was a band member of Keith Jarrett's European group. And I think this was, this was recorded in 75, no, 75. I think that he may have been busy touring and recording, possibly, potentially, after this with Keith Jarrett, which is why he didn't appear on the future Eberhard Weber Colors albums. This was a real find. This is one of those things I only saw once in a record store. I bought it when I saw it and never saw it again. The New Jazz Festival, Hamburg, 1975. I bought it new and sealed for $3.99. I want to say I bought this about 1982 or 83. This is not an ECM album, and every single one of these artists are ECM artists, oddly enough. It's got Dave Liebman's Lookout Farm. Now, Dave Liebman actually recorded around this time as a leader for ECM. He didn't do much work for ECM as a leader, but he was recording for them around this time. And I'm not sure if the Lookout Farm album actually came out on ECM, but he had recorded for ECM at this time. Trumpeter Thomas Stanko plays on here. You're not going to be able to read that anyway. And Thomas Stanko recorded very early in the ECM, I believe, label's history, and in recent years has come back and played with them, and I believe currently is on their roster, and he's recorded albums in recent history. Terje Repdal's Odyssey, a live track, And Eberhard Weber, the reason I'm showing this, is Colors does a live track, and this is with John Christensen on drums, so this would have been right around the time of the Yellow Fields album that I just showed. Well, that album was recorded in 75, and this is 75, so that makes sense. And this was a track on here that they didn't record on any of their albums. So it was a track composed by Rainier Bruninghouse and Weber together, the only time I saw a co-writing credit from them. And being vinyl, you can tell, I think certainly Tertiary Ripple track is kind of like faded out. They give like a fake ending to it. Because it's a track Rolling Stone. The original track Rolling Stone was like a 20-minute track on the record that it's on the Odyssey album. So I think the vinyl limitations, unfortunately, if this had been a CD, you might have gotten another extra track from each of the artists or something like this. This runs about 44 minutes, and each performance is like 10 or 11 minutes. So I tend to think that almost sometimes their selection of the tune had more to do with the length, except the Tertiary Ripple thing, which I'm pretty sure was faded out after about a 10-minute point. But this I never saw mentioned anywhere. That's because it's not an ECM album, and yet every single artist is an ECM artist. It's on Polydor. Oddly enough, Polydor in America at this time was releasing ECM albums. So it's a weird kind of oddity that they would have this by ECM artists, release it, but it didn't come out on the ECM label. There's one other, and I've only seen this in recent history. There's one other festival-type album, multi-artist album, that I believe was recorded in the late 70s, that there's one Eberhard Weber live track on there. And I saw it on eBay once, and it was some ridiculous price. And I believe it only ever came out on vinyl. I don't recall the name of the album. I don't even know who the other artists were. I know there was just one live track from Eberhard Weber on there, but just knowing it exists kind of pains me because I don't have it, and the chances of me obtaining it are almost next to nothing. I think the one time I saw it on vinyl, it was a German import, so it looked like it was a record that only came out in Germany, whereas that Polydor was actually an American release. I think that album just came out and was one of those things that they just put out, in 75, 76, and just let it go right out of print, the kind of thing to hopefully attract some attention to the artists, but not put a big push behind it or keep it in print. And my vinyl's very well worn of that. I started going back in Eberhard Weber's history. I'm going backwards pretty much in his history. Here's his very first solo album, The Colors of Chloe. Another one by his wife. This is odd because this is an early formative album. The first side has some great pieces that are written out. This is probably more of a composed album. Of course, he has band albums and composed albums. Even though he has a basically small group with Rainier Bruninghouse again, or for the first time, playing keyboards. Eberhard Weber on bass, switches off between two different drummers, and Ack von Royen on flugelhorn. This is the only time that Eberhard Weber used Ack von Royen up until his current album that just came out, where he had Ack von Royen come in and play flugelhorn again over some pre-recorded bass solos that Eberhard Weber had. Didn't even know they kept in touch all those years. But even though it appears to be a small group situation, he's got the cellos of the Südfunk Symphony Orchestra Stuttgart and a choir on here, a choir of a few people anyway, overdubbed. This is a composed album, even though the basic band looks like a jazz quartet kind of setting. Oddly enough, this is a little. The first side is very composed stuff. There's a lot of overdubbing on there, and a lot of cellos and things like that on the first side. The second side is a bit more. It's one long piece that runs for almost 20 minutes. 19 minutes and 56 seconds. And it's more of a jazz rock thing. And probably the closest thing to a mainstream jazz rock thing that Eberhard Weber ever did. And oddly enough, I didn't know this until years later. This is a very popular album amongst people that really aren't even ECM fanatics or were early ECM fanatics, just in the earliest days from this period. They say they really liked that album, and yet they didn't follow his career. I've heard a few folks say that in my age range and older. This was December 73 this was recorded, so this would have come out in 74. not a favorite of mine. I mean, it's a good album, good for anybody else. But I think he surpassed this many times in the years. And Fluid Russell is one of those. But this is one of those composed albums. There's a little bit of room for solos. Like I said, the second side is more of a jazz rock thing, and there's sections that work for me and don't work for me. But again, Rainier Bruninghaus was on there, so there's a lot of Rainier Bruninghaus spread out on his albums, being the keyboard player that he primarily preferred to work with. Here's another solo album, jumping around this catalog. August '76, this was recorded. This is beautiful. This could be the thing to play for people that don't like jazz, or I don't know, just want to hear some beautiful music. There's only one track that has a little bit of avant-garde bass soloing on it and sound effects. This is a composed album. This is one of his composed albums, another cover by his wife. Very composed album. This is Eberhard Weber on bass. Once again, Rainier Bruninghaus on keyboards. I think the only album I showed that Rainier Bruninghaus isn't on out of all of these so far was the Fluid Russell album, which had no keyboards, had Gary Burton on vibes instead. So Rainier Bruninghaus on keyboards, Eberhard Weber on bass, no rhythm section. It's strictly cellos, French horns, and oboe, who were members of the Philharmonic Orchestra of Oslo, Norway. So all those cello parts, French horns, oboe, love the sound of the French horn. Obviously all written pieces. And the interesting thing with this is the main melodies are pretty much entirely played by the bass. So there's a lot of overdub bass. The bass is taking its traditional role of playing bass. The keyboards, it's mostly acoustic and electric piano. I don't think there's any synthesizers on here at all. No, there's no synthesizers, just Rainier Bruninghaus on acoustic and electric piano. And the bass plays its traditional function, and covering the bass line area, but also plays just about all the melodies, the main melodies, which you would assume, looking at this, probably comes from the cellos or the French horns or the oboe or something like that. Most of it actually comes from the bass. But the colors of the orchestra are fantastic. And this isn't music that could really be reproduced live by a small group. So this is definitely a composed album. This was, if I was trying to convince somebody to like Eberhard Weber, this might be the one I would play. Following morning. August '76. So, where am I? I don't know. As a result of hearing Rainier Bruninghaus, naturally how one artist leads to the other, on so many of Eberhard Weber's recordings, I had to pick up naturally when he started recording solo albums. I had to pick them up. So he did two for ECM. This one in August 1980, which came out, which would have been recorded shortly after the Little Movements album, which was my very first album I bought by him. This is interesting. There's no bass player on this. Very interesting. It's got John Christensen on drums, my favorite drummer in the world, who had played early on with Colors Group. Kenny Wheeler on flugelhorn. This isn't the first place I heard Kenny Wheeler. By that time I was into the Azimuth group, of which Kenny Wheeler is the third member. Breiner Hoff on oboe and English horn. So it's interesting. So two horn players, a drummer, and a lot of electronic keyboards, but no bass player. This is my favorite solo album by him. A few years later, in, I want to say 83, I can't find it on here. September 83, yes, this was recorded. His second and last solo album for ECM. This time it was a trio, but a very similar setup to his first album, in that it's keyboards, drums by Freddie Studer, and Marcus Stockhausen on trumpet. So once again, no bass, and he's got a horn player, and a lot of his electric keyboards, and acoustic piano, and a drummer. This is good as well. I prefer the first one, but that goes to show you how one artist leads to the other. Eberhard Weber continued to record. I don't have his full discography here to show. I'm just showing the ones I have on vinyl, which I also have on CD. He continued on past what I'm going to show, but I have those all on CD, and this isn't so much maybe a history of everything he's done, but rather the early years, I guess you want to call it. So, March 1982, he had kind of stopped with Colors and decided not to continue with the band anymore. So when it came time to record another album that he decided to be more of a group album than a composed album, he had to put together the band from scratch. And nice band. Mike DePasqua, the drummer, that he had played with and met in Jan Garbrick's group. Eberhard Weber was a member of Jan Garbrick's group as well. Paul McCandless, the oboe, French horn, saxophone player from Oregon, plays on here. I wasn't aware that Eberhard Weber even knew him, so that was interesting. Bill Frisell, once again, in his first appearance with Eberhard Weber since the Fluid Russell album 3 years prior to this, plays with him again, and Lyle Mays, the keyboard player from Pat Metheny Group, who sticks just the piano here. A little surprising that Lyle Mays didn't play synthesizer on here, because he's very well known for his synthesizer colors that he brought into the Pat Metheny Group and on his solo projects as well. This is a band project. There's 3 pieces on here that are, themes that are composed, and then the band solos around them. There's a 4th piece, which is probably the poorest title that Eberhard Weber ever gave to any of his pieces, I guess a little tongue-in-cheek, called, I can't find it now, Death in the Car Wash. That's got to be the worst title, because his titles tend to be a lot more picturesque than that. But Death in the Car Wash is 16 and a half minutes. There's one little riff in there that sounds like a composed, worked-out riff. Apart from that, it's pretty much the entire band just soloing, taking turns soloing, improvising. And it's like, you can almost picture, when you hear it, when you listen to it, you can actually picture them in the studio giving a visual cue. Okay, here's where we're going to play the riff, because instead of starting with the riff, they kind of just start improvising. One musician jumps in at a time until the full band is playing, and then the solos start, and then all the way at the end, it's almost like, here's where we're going to play that riff, guys, remember? And then the band plays the riff. So this sounds like there was more. The other 3 pieces are a little bit more composed, like there's a real theme to them, and there's plenty of solo space. But this is probably the most improvised album of his career, and a lot of people said they like this better than the Colors albums, and I don't see it. I prefer the Color albums. It's just taste, though. And I love that another photo by his wife. I'm sure his wife did that. She did all his albums until her passing. Continuing on this thread, September '84. I think this may be the last vinyl I purchased by him too, because then the CD era was around. Chorus. Chorus looks like a small group album, but is closer to being a composed album. Eberhard Weber plays synthesizer on this for the first time on any of his albums. He actually plays a keyboard on here. In addition to his bass, he's got Jan Garbrick on saxophones on here. He was a member of Jan Garbrick's groups for many years, and was at this time. And Ralph Hubner on drums, or Hubner on drums, who was one of the drummers that played on The Colors of Chloe, his very first solo album. I didn't know they kept in touch, and all of a sudden, all these years later, this is about a dozen years later, 11 or 12 years after The Colors of Chloe, all of a sudden the drummer comes back. Now that's credited almost like it was just a 3-piece band. But then in small print, which is something that's unusual for ECM, they list 2 other musicians who play horn instruments that were clarinet and flute, played by Manfred Hofbauer, and there's oboe and English horn by Martin Kustner. And I tend to think the reason that those guys are in smaller print is I believe that there was some, well, you can hear it. Their sections were strictly things that were written out for them to play, while the other 3 musicians got to solo and perform more as a trio band. And those horn players are more stating themes. They don't get to solo, so they come in and out of the mix. They'll be at the beginning of a track, and maybe restate a theme at the end of a track. So it's a bit like more of a composed album with a lot of improvisation in between. This is a little bit in between, and some odd keyboard work by Eberhard Weber. The synthesizer voice is in part of this is quite noticeably prominent. but there's no like solos taken on the keyboard. It seems more there to fill out the sound. It's interesting. The first time I heard Eberhard Weber play keyboards at all. And during his history of his solo albums, which, you know, even though they're popular in a cultish way, I guess by no, and he did some touring, I know, with Colors at the very least. Sadly enough, he probably wouldn't earn enough money to make a living solely on the solo albums. During the mid-70s, Eberhard Weber was a member of Gary Burton's group. And even got a name check on here, too. And this was recorded in July '74. So Eberhard Weber did, I know, several tours, and I know he played the United States with Gary Burton as well during this period. And this is also the same period where he started recording solo albums. I think December '73 was The Colors of Chloe, his first solo album. And so, you know, during the course of recording his solo albums, he was very much a part of other people's bands, and Gary Burton was one of them. He did a lot of one-off projects, too, I know, that I'm only finding about years later. But this, again, an ECM recording. Mick Goodrick, the guitarist, is on here, and this is where Pat Metheny really started his career here. He's on here, too, guitarist. Steve Swallow's on here, which is just on every Gary Burton album in this period for actually many, many years. They were the two guys, Gary Burton and Steve Swallow, the electric bassist, played together on everything Burton did for many, many years. Those were the two constants throughout all of Gary Burton's groups. Bob Moses is a drummer that was very well known at this time and has kind of disappeared from view a bit more, but it was all over jazz releases. He was also the drummer on the very first Pat Metheny solo album, Bright Size Life. Eberhard Weber on bass. There's actually two bassists on here. And it was an interesting kind of feature at the time because they also toured in that configuration. And Eberhard Weber said they just worked out. Eberhard Weber's playing this kind of electrified upright bass, but it's a bit tonally different than the four-string electric bass that Steve Swallow plays. So the two of them would kind of work out just so they wouldn't cross each other's paths too much, which one would be playing the lower end parts on their bass, and the other bassists would be playing the higher end, so that they wouldn't be clashing. And I know they toured at this time. Everybody loves Ring. I love Ring. But the album that came after that these guys recorded, Passengers, I think I like better. And again, I'm the only one. Everybody prefers Ring over this. They're both iconic albums, I think. I love that cover. So this was, again, Eberhard Weber's still part of his group, November '76. So this is obviously weaving in between Eberhard Weber's solo albums. Pretty much the same band. Guitarist Mick Goodrick is left. So Pat Metheny is still here, and this is the only, he's the only guitarist on this, with Burton on vibes. Steve Swallow is still the bass player. Eberhard Weber is still the second bass player. Bob Moses, the drummer, is left, and Dan Gottlieb is the drummer on this. And after this, Pat Metheny and Dan Gottlieb recorded Watercolors with Eberhard Weber, which was the second Pat Metheny album, and with Dan Gottlieb on drums, and then formed the original Pat Metheny group, which also had Dan Gottlieb on drums, who's the drummer on this. So this is the last. This was really the last album, and a lot of musicians dropped off here. Eberhard Weber went on. Dan Gottlieb, Pat Metheny started their own thing, and Steve Swallow stayed and continued to play with Gary Burton for many years. Love this album. Both of the albums have a piece by Eberhard Weber, by the way, reinterpretation. Yellow Fields, which was a piece on, the Yellow Fields album by Eberhard Weber, is reinterpreted here for Gary Burton's group. And on this album, Eberhard Weber's The Colors of Chloe, the title track of Eberhard Weber's very first solo album, is done here by the group. 7.5-minute version of that. So it was nice because the arrangements are very different. If you're familiar with those Eberhard Weber originals from his solo albums, they're very different. The arrangements are very different on the Gary Burton albums, and it's nice to hear a very familiar piece in a different context. after his tenure with Gary Burton, he was naturally still recording solo albums, but Eberhard Weber went on and became the bass player for Jan Garbarek, and started in '78. December '78 was this first album. I'm pretty sure this is the first album that Eberhard Weber plays on of Jan Garbarek groups, called Picture This. Beautiful, excellent album. This is one of the most lyrical Jan Garbarek albums to this day, even though it goes back all the way to '78. My only problem with Jan Garbarek is sometimes he gets a little screechy on the saxophone player. He's a saxophone player. This one has a bit less of that, quite a bit less of that. I can see people throwing things at their computer screen now. I every once in a while, Jan Garbarek goes a little bit scratchy, screechy for me. And yet, I love the way he writes and the way that he forms groups and what he lets the musicians in the groups do. Now, Garbarek writes all the material on his solo albums, so unfortunately Eberhard Weber doesn't really get to compose for these, or they don't reinterpret any of his pieces. But, boy, this is it's a friggin' great group on here. You got Jan Garbarek on saxophones, you've got Eberhard Weber on bass, you've got John Christensen on drums. Yay, John Christensen, my favorite drummer in the world. I love that guy. And Bill Connors on guitars. This wasn't my introduction to Bill Connors, but Bill Connors was actually the original guitarist of Return to Forever, what he's best known for, before Al Di Meola. But he recorded several solo albums for Paul Blaze, for ECM, as a leader, which are all excellent, and also recorded at the same time in the late 70s with Paul Blaze, independent artists, improvising artists label. And he recorded several albums with Paul Bly, pianist. And John Taylor on piano. I'm not sure. I think I had an azimuth. John Taylor, I don't think this is the first place I heard him, because John Taylor is also the second person in azimuth, whatever. The thing is these albums that I've showed between Eberhard Weber and Jan Garbarek, you've got I was introduced to the entire azimuth group, which is Norma Winstone on vocals. She was a vocalist on Eberhard Weber's Fluid Russell album. Kenny Wheeler, who had played trumpet on one of Eberhard Weber. What album did I show that he played trumpet on? I'm lost. Gee, I don't know. Was it Rainier Bruninghouse? Yeah, I think it was Rainier Bruninghouse. And now you've got John Taylor, the pianist, and that's the entire azimuth trio, spread out throughout this little collection of albums here. This is a really fantastic album, and a bigger group. Most Jan Garbarek's groups were quartets. And this is a quintet. This is a 5-piece, so it has piano and guitar, bass drums, and Jan Garbarek on sax. Probably, if I was going to have one Jan Garbarek album, this could be it. But Eberhard Weber was a part of that. That was in '78. Eberhard Weber continued on as a member. This goes to December '81. This is a fantastic, beautiful cover. Jan Garbarek group continued. Over this period, one musician would pretty much change with each album. There was no keyboardist on this. John Taylor doesn't play on this. The Jan Garbarek group got down to a quartet, which was, at this point, Jan Garbarek still on saxophones, Eberhard Weber still on bass. John Christensen was still the drummer, as he was on the previous album, Photo, with. And now we've got Bill Frisell, who, on guitar, replacing Bill Connors. And again, Bill Frisell, very familiar to me, even though he hadn't done a lot of sessions at this time, because he had played on Fluid Russell. And this was before his first solo album even came out. But he had also played on the Later This Evening Eberhard Weber album from '82, and this is '81. After this album came out, I bought this as a new release. I saw them play live in New York. The only time I'd ever seen Eberhard Weber live or Jan Garbarek live. And John Christensen had left by the time the album was released. and it was Mike DePasqua was his replacement, and that was the lineup that recorded the next album with John Christensen off and away, unfortunately, but the fantastic, talented Mike DePasqua on drums in his place. So I saw the tour supporting that album, and I was expecting to see John Christensen, who I've never seen live, but what I saw was the lineup that made this next album, Wayfarer, in 1983. This was recorded March '83. That must have been, roughly around the time that I saw them play live. And the lineup again: Jan Garbarek. It's still got Bill Frisell on guitar, still got Eberhard Weber on bass, and the one-member change that was required for each album, it seemed. And Mike DePasqua was on drums, replacing John Christensen. This is a bit more fusion-oriented. This one, not one of my favorites, but this is one that I have to give more of a chance to, I think, because Eberhard Weber did pick a track from that album, from this particular album, from Wayfarer, to include on his own best of compilation, the Rarum album on ECM. I was surprised at that inclusion, actually. And Eberhard Weber, all this time he's still recording solo albums, still playing with Garbarek. December of '84, another Jan Garbarek group album comes out. And this is the last one I have to show, actually, only because I strictly went CD after this. So once again, Jan Garbarek on saxophones, Eberhard Weber still hanging in there on bass, still got Mike DePasqua on drums. This is his second outing now with the Jan Garbarek group. And Bill Frisell has left, though, and the guitarist in his place is David Torn. This is my favorite David Torn playing ever. David Torn, for me, tends to get a little wild and crazy and Jimi Hendrix-like. And yet I buy his stuff, and I like a lot of it. Sometimes he gets just too aggressive, or noisy, or whatever you want to call it, or techno, whatever. It seems like he listened to the prior albums of the Jan Garbarek group, which had more restrained guitar. He certainly had heard the prior album, Paths and Prince, which had Bill Frisell on guitar. Bill Frisell's playing was a lot sparser on that album, and got a little more aggressive on the Wayfarer album. But it seems like David Torn was familiar, at least with the Paths and Prince album that Bill Frisell played on. And I wouldn't say limited himself, but kind of cut down a bit on the noise. And this is my favorite playing of David Torn's on this. He gets a lot of solo space, as Jan Garbarek always gives a lot of solo space to his band members. So there's a lot of guitar solo sections in here. David Torn also plays some keyboard synthesizer, the old DX7 keyboard synthesizer. This is a fine return to form. The Wayfarer thing started getting a little noisy for me. And oddly enough, even though David Torn's known for making noise, his restrained playing is really what helps make some nice colors on this. I'm going to go listen to this as soon as I'm done yakking here, I think, as well as some of the others. Now, Eberhard Weber continued to play with Jan Garbarek all the way until he had his stroke. There was one album that Jan Garbarek recorded called Places, oddly enough, that had no bass at all. And that was, I want to say, about 1978. So I don't know if Eberhard Weber was unavailable or whether it was a different concept. But it might have been 79. I should have pulled it out, but I didn't because Eberhard Weber's not on it. But there's no bass on that. With the exception of that album, Eberhard Weber pretty much played on just about in every Jan Garbarek group album that came out. And even Jan Garbarek's solo albums that had things like cellos on there, he didn't have bassists. So there was no other bassist that he played with from 1978 until Weber had his stroke, and I don't know what year that is now, 2000 something. But he either used Eberhard Weber on bass, or he didn't use a bassist. And that stayed the same until he had to very quickly find a replacement to continue a tour that he had booked for his group, which was built around having a bass player and a keyboard player and a drummer. So then he started using other folks. Kind of a testament to I guess, how he felt about Eberhard Weber. And Eberhard Weber, in an interview, was even surprised at how much Garbrick had used him and that he hadn't used anyone else in all those years. He's the only constant in Jan Garbrick's discography, with the exception of a couple times when he didn't use bass at all, spread out over many years. He chose Eberhard Weber. If you hear his albums, and you either, I don't know, in some cases, he might be an artist you either get or you don't get, but if you get it, you can see why. Kate Bush, the British singer-songwriter, is an enormous fan of Eberhard Weber's solo albums, and actually had him play on 2 or 3 of her solo albums. Not on every track. He appears sporadically throughout the tracks on the albums. She's quite a lady with eclectic tastes, apparently. But I think it's very cool when somebody from an entirely different musical area like that has an appreciation for somebody that is so different and outside of their field. There must be something in there for him of his music that Kate Bush found to love, and I'm sure it's the same things that I hear and people like Lyle Mays hear and sing his praises and all that. I thought I was going to do a 25-minute video. I didn't, and I'm not going to make this an hour, but unfortunately it's too close to it for comfort. But I wanted to do an Eberhard Weber thing. I continued, his albums continued far after the early 80s ones I showed. I just stopped when the CD era started. I did say that he did two types of albums. He did a group album, which is like a jazz group with improvisation, and then he did his composed albums, which have far less improvisation and are more written things. In the late 80s, around 88, he started doing a third type of album, which was mostly solo bass performances, and that was the third type of album. He did an album called Orchestra, which oddly enough has an orchestra on one track, but the rest of the album is all overdubbed bass tracks of his, all the compositions just overdubbed bass, followed by an album called Pendulum, which came out several years later, which was entirely solo bass, no other guest appearances anywhere. And so he has basically 3 different genres, types of albums he does, so it's possible that people may enjoy one and not the other. I think people more into classical music might like his composed stuff more. People more into jazz groups would probably appreciate the small group jazz things, with drummers and those kind of things that they can hear rhythms and themes and solos, laid out in a way that's more easily understandable, I guess. But he's one of my top 4 guys, along with Bar Phillips, Terry Riley, Harold Budd. I have tons of respect and love many other musicians, but I have those top 4 guys. It's a tough group to get into. So that's it, guys. I'm going to actually go and listen to some of this music I showed now. I kind of whet my own appetite for it. And I'm sorry for going on so long. Feel free to fall asleep to any of my videos. I won't be offended. Alright, guys. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching. Appreciate your comments and your viewership. Take care.